The alarm inside my observation pod screamed before I even understood what it was reacting to. Red light filled the narrow chamber, bouncing off metal walls that suddenly felt too small to breathe in. My hands trembled over the control panel as sensor readings spiked past every safe threshold I had been trained to expect. I was not supposed to be this close. My name is Varel, and I was sent from the Continuum Observation Directorate to watch a single planet from a careful, silent distance. That planet was Earth. My task was simple on paper. Record, document, report. Do not interfere. Do not get involved. Humans, according to every briefing I received, were a young species still fighting among themselves, and my superiors considered the assignment almost beneath serious attention. It was meant to be quiet work, passive work, the kind of task given to someone whose career had not yet proven itself. I took the assignment because I had no better option. I did not take it because I understood what I was walking into. The pod shook again, and this time I heard something outside the hull that should not have been possible to hear from orbit. A distant thrum, low and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat multiplied 1,000 times over. I checked the readings again, certain my instruments had failed. They had not failed. Below me, across a stretch of land bordered by a wide river and a broken tree line, thousands of humans were moving through the dark in coordinated formation, not walking, not fleeing, advancing with a discipline that unsettled me more than any single act of aggression could have. My translators picked up fragments of communication, voices layered over each other in tight, controlled bursts. Hold the left flank, fall back to the ridge, regroup at the marker. Nobody left behind, not today, not ever. I had studied dozens of species before this assignment. None of them spoke to each other like that in the middle of chaos. Fear should have fractured their communication. Instead, it sharpened it. I told myself this was simply an unusually organized skirmish. I told myself it would end quickly, the way most young species eventually exhaust themselves and stop. I told myself a great many things that night, sitting alone in my pod, watching lights flicker across a battlefield that stretched farther than my sensors could fully map. I was wrong about almost all of it. My first mistake was believing that distance would keep me detached. I had watched conflicts before, on other worlds, from orbit, through layers of glass and data, and careful academic language. Detachment came easily when the subjects were unfamiliar, when their expressions did not translate into anything my own species recognized. Humans were different. Their faces, even distorted through low-resolution scans, carried something my mind refused to file away as simply data. I saw a young man press his palm against another man's shoulder before they split apart into separate positions, saying nothing, needing nothing more than that single gesture. I saw a woman crouched behind a fallen support beam, speaking calmly into a communicator to guide a group of frightened soldiers toward safety, her voice steady, even as the ground shook beneath her. I saw children, too young to be anywhere near danger, being carried away from the fighting by adults who moved as if the entire world depended on getting them out. None of this matched the reports I had read before departure. The briefing documents described humans as impulsive, disorganized, and short-lived in their conflicts. Fragile, predictable, easy to categorize and move past. I began to understand, within the first several hours of real observation, that whoever wrote those reports had never actually watched a human fight for something they refused to lose. I remember the exact moment my professional distance began to crack. A group of perhaps 30 soldiers found themselves surrounded on 3 sides, their support cut off, their numbers cut down to a fraction of what they had started with. According to every strategic model I had been trained on, from a dozen different civilizations across a dozen different star systems, that group should have surrendered. Continuing to hold a position with those odds served no tactical purpose. Logic demanded retreat or capitulation. They did neither. I listened as their commanding officer, a man named Callum, gave an order that made no sense to me at the time. We hold until the others are clear. That is the whole plan. That is the only plan. I ran the numbers through my ship's tactical computer, expecting it to confirm what I already suspected, that holding the position accomplished nothing beyond delaying an inevitable loss. The computer returned exactly that conclusion: delay only, no strategic gain beyond time. They held anyway. I watched through my long-range optics as they dug into whatever cover they could find, passing supplies hand to hand, checking on each other in short, clipped sentences that carried none of the fear I would have expected given their situation. A young woman named Isla kept repeating a phrase to the soldier beside her, over and over, like a rhythm to keep his hands steady. Almost there, just a little longer. I did not understand, in that moment, what she meant by almost there. There was no reinforcement inbound according to any communication I had intercepted. There was no extraction plan visible on my sensors. As far as I could tell, she was comforting him with a lie. Hours later, I understood. She was not lying about rescue. She was lying about the fear, giving him something small and steady to hold on to so his hands would not shake when it mattered most. It worked. His hands did not shake. That single detail unsettled me more than any explosion or blast, more than any of the destruction spreading across the terrain below. It was not the violence of the moment that disturbed me. It was the quiet, deliberate kindness humans offered each other in the middle of it, as if gentleness and survival were not opposites, but tools used together. I began taking notes I was not authorized to take. Personal observations, separate from the official log. I told myself it was simply thorough documentation, the kind any responsible observer would compile. In truth, I could not stop myself from writing down every small human choice that contradicted everything I thought I understood about how a species behaves when its life is at stake. By the time the sun rose over that particular stretch of land, the group led by Callum had not been overrun. They had not won a decisive victory either. Reinforcements did eventually arrive, later than expected, delayed by conditions on the ground that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with simple bad luck. When the relief force reached the ridge, they found exhausted soldiers still holding their positions, still checking on each other, still speaking to one another in that same steady rhythm. Nobody left behind. I sat back in my chair once the immediate danger had passed, my hands still slightly unsteady on the console. I had been sent to observe a young, chaotic species locked in a conflict that my superiors considered a minor curiosity. I had expected disorder. I had expected fear, collapsing into panic, the way I had seen in other early-stage civilizations during similar observation assignments. Instead, I had watched 30 people choose to stay in danger, not because a superior officer forced them to, and not because retreat was impossible, but because leaving meant abandoning others who needed more time. I had watched a woman calm a frightened man with a gentle lie that turned out not to be a lie at all. I had watched an entire unit move and speak and think as if they were a single organism built entirely out of care for each other. My pod systems chimed quietly, informing me that it was time to compile my first formal report back to the Directorate. I stared at the blank input field for a long time before writing anything. I had come to this assignment expecting to feel nothing. I had expected to watch, record, and move on to the next task without a second thought, the way observers were trained to operate. Detachment was not simply encouraged in my line of work. It was required. But something had shifted in me during those hours above the ridge, something I did not yet have a name for. It was not fear of the humans below me. It was something closer to the beginning of respect, tangled together with an unease I could not quite explain. I began typing my first report, choosing my words carefully, aware that whatever I wrote would shape how my superiors understood this species going forward. Subjects display unexpectedly high levels of coordinated behavior under extreme stress. Initial threat assessment requires revision. I stopped typing and looked back down at the planet below me, at the small fires still burning across the ridge, at the shapes of soldiers moving slowly among their fallen equipment, checking on each other one final time before the relief force took over. I did not know yet how much more I would witness in the days ahead. I did not know how deeply this assignment would change the way I understood, not just humans, but the very idea of what a species could be capable of when everything was on the line. I only knew, sitting alone in that small metal pod above a battlefield that refused to make sense according to any model I had ever studied, that I had been wrong to think this would be easy work. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the faint static hum of my own equipment, and allowed myself a single quiet thought before returning to my duties. Whatever this assignment turned out to be, it was not going to be the simple, forgettable task I had expected when I first left home. The days that followed my first report brought a strange new discipline to my work, one built not on detachment but on obsession. I told myself I was simply being thorough. In truth, I could not stop watching. My pod remained fixed above the same general region, close enough to track the ongoing conflict as it shifted from the ridge to a series of small settlements scattered along the river basin. I expanded my sensor range, adjusted my translation filters, and began cataloging individual humans by name whenever I could identify them clearly enough. This was not standard procedure. Observers were trained to think in terms of groups, patterns, and statistical behavior, not individuals. Names made things personal. Personal made things dangerous for an observer who was supposed to remain uninvolved. I cataloged them anyway. There was Callum, the officer who had held the ridge, now leading a smaller detachment tasked with protecting a supply route that ran through a shallow valley. There was Isla, the woman whose steady voice had calmed a frightened soldier during the worst of the fighting, now serving as a communications coordinator for the same detachment. There was a younger soldier, named Peter, barely out of what I understood to be early adulthood by human standards, assigned to forward scouting duties because of his quick reflexes and sharp eyesight. I watched them move through their days with a rhythm that felt almost domestic despite the danger surrounding them. They joked with each other during quiet stretches. They complained about food rations and uncomfortable equipment. They shared small moments of laughter that seemed entirely disconnected from the seriousness of their situation, and yet somehow those same moments made their discipline during actual danger even more striking by comparison. I began to understand something about humans that no briefing document had prepared me for. They were not simply enduring their circumstances. They were living inside them, finding small pockets of ordinary life within extraordinary danger, refusing to let the conflict define every single moment of their existence. This made them harder to categorize. It also made them harder to look away from. On the fourth day of this closer observation, I witnessed an event that forced me to reconsider everything I believed about human resilience. A supply convoy moving through the valley came under sudden pressure from an opposing force that had somehow avoided detection by every scanning method available to the humans below. I watched the attack unfold from my position in orbit, my sensors recording every movement in far greater detail than the humans themselves could perceive in real time. Their equipment was primitive compared to mine. Their reaction times, by any objective measurement, should have been too slow to prevent significant losses. And yet, within seconds of the first contact, the convoy shifted formation with a speed that startled even my own predictive systems. Peter, the young scout, called out a warning that reached the convoy just moments before the opposing force made their move. His voice carried none of the panic I would have expected from someone his age facing sudden danger. Instead, it carried precise, clipped information. Contact left flank. Take cover behind the ridgeline. Callum's group is already moving to support. I ran the timing again afterward, unable to quite believe what my own sensors had recorded. Between the moment Peter spotted the danger and the moment the convoy reorganized into a defensible position, only a handful of seconds had passed. Humans, without any of the advanced coordination systems my own civilization relied upon, had somehow synchronized their response almost perfectly, relying entirely on trust, built through repetition, training, and something less easily defined. I remember thinking, in that moment, that perhaps what I was witnessing was not simply tactical skill. It was something closer to instinct, sharpened by care for one another, refined through countless hours of shared danger, until it became almost automatic. The convoy held. Losses were minimal. When the immediate danger passed, I watched Callum walk along the length of the convoy, checking on each person individually, asking questions that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with well-being. Are you hurt? Do you need anything? Take a moment before we move again. I found myself writing down his exact words, unable to shake the feeling that something important was contained within that simple exchange. A commanding officer, responsible for the safety of dozens of people, taking the time to ask each one individually how they were doing, even in the middle of an ongoing crisis. This was not weakness. I understood that now. This was strength expressed in a form I had never encountered before, strength that included softness rather than excluding it. My observations continued in this manner for several more days, each new event adding another layer to my growing understanding of what humans were truly capable of. I watched a young woman named Grace, part of a medical support team, work through exhaustion that should have made continued function impossible by any reasonable standard, tending to injured soldiers with a steadiness that betrayed none of the fatigue I knew she must have been experiencing. I watched an older soldier named Martin, clearly nearing the end of his active service based on the deference younger soldiers showed him, take time during a rare quiet moment to teach a group of newer recruits a technique for staying calm during high-stress situations. His method was simple: focus on one task at a time, trust the person beside you, breathe before you act, not after. I watched these small moments accumulate into something larger than any single act of coordination or bravery. I was watching a species that had built its entire capacity for survival not around individual strength, but around collective trust, refined through generations of shared hardship into something that looked, from where I sat, almost like a form of unspoken devotion. This realization troubled me more than I expected it to. My training had prepared me to assess threats, catalog behaviors, and report findings without becoming emotionally entangled in the outcomes I observed. Detachment was the entire foundation of my profession, and yet here I was, feeling something uncomfortably close to concern every time Callum's detachment came under pressure, feeling something uncomfortably close to relief every time Isla's calm voice guided frightened soldiers back to safety. I told myself this was simply an unusual assignment, that any observer studying a species this complex would experience similar reactions. I told myself the discomfort would fade once I grew accustomed to their patterns. It did not fade. If anything, it deepened. On the seventh day of close observation, the conflict escalated in a way that none of my predictive models had anticipated. A larger force began moving toward the valley from the north, far exceeding the numbers currently defending the supply route. My sensors detected the approaching force nearly a full day before any human early warning system could have picked up the same signals. I found myself facing a decision that no observer training had prepared me for. I was not permitted to interfere. Every regulation I had been taught, every guideline written into the Continuum Observation Directorate's founding principles, made this absolutely clear. Observers watched. They did not warn. They did not assist. They did not become part of the events they were sent to study, regardless of the outcome. I sat in my pod, watching the approaching force grow closer on my sensors, knowing that Callum's detachment had no way of detecting the danger heading toward them until it was almost too late to properly prepare. I told myself, over and over, that this was not my responsibility. I told myself that humans had survived countless similar situations without my help, that their own resourcefulness would find a way to manage whatever came next. The same resourcefulness I had spent the past several days documenting with something dangerously close to admiration. I did not act, not yet, but something inside me had already shifted, and I understood, even as I sat frozen at my console, that continuing to watch in silence was becoming harder with every passing hour. The approaching force drew closer through the night, and I remained at my station, unable to look away, unable to act, caught somewhere between the strict boundaries of my assignment and a growing, uncomfortable pull toward the people I had been sent only to observe. I did not sleep that night. I do not think I could have, even if my duties had allowed it. Somewhere below me, Callum's detachment continued their rounds, unaware of what was moving toward them through the dark. Somewhere below me, Isla continued coordinating communications with the same steady voice she always used. Somewhere below me, Peter kept watch along the perimeter, his sharp eyes scanning a horizon that gave no visible sign of the danger my own instruments could see clearly. I watched all of it unfold in silence, my hands hovering over controls I was not supposed to use, my mind caught in a conflict of its own that had nothing to do with strategy or tactics, and everything to do with a growing, undeniable sense that simply observing was no longer something I could do without consequence. Whatever came next, I understood that my role in this assignment was about to change, whether the Directorate approved of it or not. The Northern Force reached the outer edge of the valley just before dawn, and I broke every regulation I had been trained to follow the moment I understood how close they truly were. I did not plan to interfere. I want to be honest about that, even now. I opened a low-frequency channel simply to test whether human equipment could even register a signal from my pod, telling myself it was a technical experiment rather than an act of intervention. The channel connected almost instantly, far faster than I expected given the difference between our technologies. Isla's voice came through first, sharp with confusion. Unknown signal detected. Identify yourself immediately. I hesitated only a moment before responding, my translator adjusting my voice into something closer to a human tone, though still carrying an unmistakable strangeness to it. Movement from the north. Larger than your current position can withstand. They will reach you within 2 hours. Silence followed, long enough that I feared she had simply cut the connection out of suspicion. Then Callum's voice replaced hers, steady despite the impossible nature of what he had just heard. Who is this, and how do you know our position? I told them the truth, or as much of it as seemed necessary in that moment. I explained that I had been observing the region from above, that my equipment had detected the approaching force well before their own systems could, and that I believed they deserved a chance to prepare rather than face a surprise they could not survive. I do not know what reaction I expected, perhaps fear, given how strange my presence must have seemed to them, perhaps suspicion, given how easily such information could have been a trap set by an enemy force using unfamiliar technology to mislead them. Instead, Callum asked a single practical question. What is their formation, and how much time do we actually have? That question changed everything about how the rest of this assignment unfolded. I spent the next several minutes relaying every detail my sensors could provide, translating complex data into terms I hoped would make sense to their equipment and their strategic thinking. Callum listened without interrupting, occasionally repeating information back, to confirm he understood it correctly, treating my presence not as an anomaly to fear, but as a resource to use. By the time the sun rose fully over the valley, the detachment had shifted their entire defensive position based on information I provided, moving supplies, repositioning personnel, and preparing contingencies that would not have existed without my intervention. I understood, watching this unfold, that I had crossed a line I could not uncross. Observers did not provide tactical information to the species they studied. Observers did not become part of the events unfolding beneath them. And yet here I was, doing exactly that, unable to convince myself that any other choice would have been acceptable given what I had witnessed over the previous days. The Northern Force arrived exactly when my sensors predicted, and found a defense far stronger and better prepared than they anticipated. I watched the resulting confrontation with a mixture of relief and something closer to shame, aware that my involvement had shifted the outcome in ways that violated everything my profession stood for. The detachment held their position. Losses on their side were far lower than my initial predictions had suggested, though not absent entirely. I watched Grace and her medical team work through the aftermath with the same steady focus I had observed before, tending to injuries with careful, practiced hands, offering quiet reassurance to soldiers whose fear had not fully faded despite their survival. When the immediate danger passed, Callum opened the channel again, his voice carrying something I had not expected to hear directed toward me. Gratitude. Plain and direct. Whoever you are, you saved lives today. I don't fully understand what you are, but I know what you did, and I won't forget it. I did not know how to respond to that. My training had never prepared me for being thanked by the subjects of my observation. I offered something simple in return, unsure if it fully captured what I actually felt in that moment. I only shared what I saw. What you did with it was entirely your own doing. This exchange marked the beginning of a relationship I never anticipated forming during this assignment. Over the following days, Callum's detachment began treating my presence not as a strange anomaly to be feared, but as an unexpected ally whose perspective from above offered advantages they had never previously possessed. I found myself providing regular updates on troop movements, weather conditions, and terrain features that my sensors could detect more efficiently than their own limited equipment. I told myself this arrangement remained within acceptable boundaries, that providing observational data did not cross into direct interference the way physical intervention would have. I understood, even as I told myself this, that the distinction was becoming increasingly difficult to defend. During this period, I grew to understand the humans below me not as subjects of a detached study, but as individuals whose lives had become intertwined with my own choices in ways I could not have predicted when I first arrived in orbit above their planet. Isla, I learned, had joined the military after her home settlement was affected by earlier stages of this same conflict, driven by a desire to protect others from experiencing similar loss. Peter, despite his youth, had already lost a close family member to the fighting, and carried that loss quietly, channeling it into the sharp vigilance that made him such an effective scout. Martin, the older soldier who taught calm breathing techniques to younger recruits, had served through multiple previous conflicts and carried a weariness that never quite left his expression, even during moments of quiet relief. Grace, the medical team leader, had trained originally as a civilian healer before the escalating conflict drew her into military service, driven by an unwillingness to let injuries go untreated, simply because the wounded happened to be soldiers rather than civilians. Each of these details deepened my understanding of what motivated this species to endure hardships that would have broken far less resilient civilizations. They were not simply following orders or fighting because circumstances demanded it. Each of them carried personal reasons, personal losses, and personal hopes that shaped every choice they made in the field. I began to understand that this was the true source of their coordination, their unwavering discipline, and their willingness to hold impossible positions rather than retreat. It was not blind obedience to command structure. It was a deep, individual commitment to protecting the people beside them, born from personal experience and reinforced through every shared hardship they endured together. This understanding came with a cost I had not anticipated. The more I learned about them as individuals, the harder it became to maintain any semblance of the professional detachment my role required. I found myself anxious during periods of silence on the communication channel, worried that something had gone wrong. I found myself relieved beyond reasonable measure whenever Callum's voice confirmed that his detachment remained safe. I was no longer simply observing this conflict. I had become invested in its outcome, invested in the survival of specific individuals whose names and stories I now knew far too intimately to view with any remaining objectivity. The conflict itself showed no signs of easing during this period. If anything, it intensified, spreading to additional settlements along the river basin as both sides committed increasing resources to securing strategic positions. I continued providing what assistance I could through observational data, careful to avoid anything that might constitute direct combat involvement, though the line between assistance and interference grew blurrier with each passing week. During one particularly difficult stretch, the detachment faced a situation that tested every resource they had, human and otherwise. A settlement housing a significant civilian population came under threat from an advancing force, and Callum's detachment found themselves stretched between defending their current position and providing support to protect those civilians. I remember the tension in Isla's voice as she coordinated between multiple channels simultaneously, trying to organize evacuation routes for the civilian population while maintaining defensive positions against the approaching threat. I remember Peter's exhausted voice reporting movement patterns from his scouting position, his usual sharpness dulled slightly by fatigue that had clearly been building for days without adequate rest. I provided everything I could through my sensors, mapping safe evacuation routes and identifying gaps in the approaching force's formation that might allow civilians to move without detection. Even with this assistance, the situation remained dangerously uncertain for hours, as families moved through unfamiliar terrain guided only by soldiers who themselves remained under constant threat. I watched Martin personally escort a group of frightened children through a narrow passage between two ridges, moving with a patience that belied the urgency of the situation, speaking to them in a calm, reassuring tone, even as his own team maintained a defensive perimeter just beyond the tree line. I watched Grace treat injuries among the fleeing civilians, even as she continued monitoring the well-being of her own military team, refusing to prioritize one group over the other despite the impossible demands this placed on her limited resources. By the time the evacuation concluded, exhaustion had settled over the entire detachment in a way I had not witnessed before. Even through the limited emotional range my sensors could detect through vocal tone and communication patterns, I understood that this event had taken something from each of them that would not easily be restored. Callum opened the channel once the immediate crisis passed, his voice carrying a weariness far deeper than physical fatigue alone could explain. "We got them out, all of them, but I don't know how many more of these we can survive." I did not have an adequate response to offer him in that moment. My understanding of human resilience, built over weeks of careful observation, told me that his detachment would continue enduring whatever came next, the same way they had endured everything before it. But I also understood, more clearly than ever, the cost this endurance carried, a cost measured not simply in resources or casualties, but in something far less tangible and far harder to replace. I began to understand, during this period, that my initial assessment of humans as simply resilient had been incomplete. They were not resilient because hardship failed to affect them. They were resilient because they continued forward despite being profoundly affected by every loss, every fear, and every impossible choice the conflict forced upon them. This distinction mattered more than I initially realized. It meant that every act of courage I had witnessed came at a genuine personal cost, paid willingly by people who understood exactly what continuing to fight required of them, and chose to pay that cost anyway for the sake of those they were protecting. I found myself during the quiet hours between crises reflecting on my own species and our relative freedom from this kind of hardship. We had achieved a stability that eliminated most forms of existential conflict generations ago. We did not know, in any real sense, what it meant to hold an impossible position simply because retreating meant abandoning someone else to danger. Watching humans navigate this reality day after day filled me with something I struggled to name at the time. It was not simply admiration, though admiration was certainly part of it. It was something closer to a profound, uncomfortable respect, tangled together with a growing dread about what continued exposure to this kind of hardship might eventually cost the people I had come to know. I did not yet understand how directly that dread would soon be tested. The weeks that followed brought a kind of exhaustion I had never expected to witness so clearly, both in the humans below me and, strangely, in myself. I had stopped thinking of my role as observation long before I admitted it openly. Every day brought new updates I relayed to Callum's detachment, new evacuation routes I mapped for Isla, new terrain warnings I passed along to Peter during his scouting missions. I had become, in every practical sense, a permanent part of their operation, even though no formal agreement or understanding had ever been reached between my directorate and their command structure. I told myself this arrangement could continue indefinitely, that my assistance was making a meaningful difference without crossing into anything my superiors would consider unacceptable interference. I understand now how naive that belief truly was. The cost of the ongoing conflict became impossible to ignore during this period, not simply in terms of resources or strategic positions, but in the visible toll it took on every person I had come to know through my observations. Grace, whose steady hands had treated countless injuries without complaint, began showing signs of exhaustion that worried even her own team members. I overheard a conversation between her and Martin during a rare quiet moment, her voice carrying a rawness I had not heard from her before. "I keep seeing their faces. Even when I close my eyes, I keep seeing all of them." Martin's response, though gentle, could not fully address the weight behind her words. "You carry more than any of us should have to carry, but you keep doing it because you know what happens if you stop." I sat with that exchange for a long time after recording it, understanding for the first time just how deeply this conflict had embedded itself into the emotional core of everyone involved. Grace did not continue treating the wounded because the horror of it had somehow become easier to bear. She continued because the alternative, allowing people to suffer without care, remained unthinkable to her, regardless of the personal cost. This same pattern repeated itself across every member of the detachment I had come to know. Isla's voice, once entirely steady during crisis coordination, began carrying brief moments of hesitation that had not existed during my earliest observations. Peter, whose sharp instincts had always seemed almost effortless, started requiring longer recovery periods after scouting missions, his youthful energy visibly worn thin by months of continuous vigilance. Even Callum, whose leadership had remained a constant source of stability throughout every crisis I witnessed, began showing signs of strain during our communications. His questions grew shorter, more direct, occasionally lacking the careful consideration that had characterized his earlier decision-making. I understood, watching this unfold, that exhaustion was beginning to erode even the strongest foundations within the detachment. I found myself, during this period, questioning whether my continued involvement was actually helping them or simply prolonging a situation that inflicted increasing damage with every passing week. Without my assistance, would the detachment have already been forced into a retreat that, while difficult, might have spared them some of the accumulated exhaustion I now witnessed daily? Or would that same retreat have resulted in losses far greater than anything they had faced with my support? I did not have a clear answer to this question, and the uncertainty itself became another weight I carried alongside everything else I had absorbed from months of close observation. The turning point, when it finally arrived, came during an operation that none of my careful data analysis had adequately prepared anyone for. A coordinated assault targeting multiple positions simultaneously overwhelmed the detachment's ability to respond effectively, spreading their limited resources across several fronts at once. I relayed information as quickly as my systems could process it, but even my advanced sensors struggled to keep pace with the rapidly shifting situation on the ground. Isla's voice, usually so composed, carried genuine alarm as she coordinated between multiple channels, trying to determine where the greatest need existed among several simultaneous crises. "We can't cover everything. We need to choose, and I don't know how to make this choice." I understood, in that moment, the true weight of the decisions this detachment faced on a regular basis, decisions I had witnessed from a comfortable distance without ever truly understanding the impossible nature of choosing between equally urgent needs. Callum made the call, his voice tight with a tension I had never heard from him before. "Protect the civilian evacuation route first. The rest of us hold as long as we can." This decision meant accepting greater risk for the detachment's own defensive positions in order to ensure civilian safety, a choice that reflected everything I had come to understand about their values, even as it filled me with a dread I struggled to control. I watched, through my sensors, as Martin led a smaller group toward the threatened evacuation route, moving with a determination that masked whatever exhaustion he carried beneath it. I watched Peter position himself along a critical vantage point, providing early warning that allowed Isla to redirect civilians away from danger just moments before the threat arrived. The operation stretched for hours, each moment carrying its own weight of uncertainty. I provided every piece of data my systems could gather, translating complex sensor readings into practical guidance as quickly as possible, aware that every second of delay could mean the difference between safety and disaster for people whose names and stories I now knew far too well. When the immediate crisis finally passed, the detachment had succeeded in protecting the civilian evacuation, though not without significant cost. I listened as Callum reported the outcome, his voice carrying a heaviness that told me more than his words alone could convey. We held. Everyone made it out, but it cost us more than I want to admit right now. I understood, listening to this report, that something fundamental had shifted within the detachment during this operation, something that went beyond simple physical exhaustion or resource depletion. They had faced an impossible choice and made it, successfully protecting those who depended on them, but the weight of that choice would remain with them long after the immediate danger had passed. In the aftermath, I found myself grappling with my own reaction to everything I had witnessed. I had begun this assignment believing detachment was not simply possible but necessary for proper observation. I now understood that detachment had become entirely impossible for me, replaced instead by a deep, personal investment in the survival and well-being of people I had never expected to care about so profoundly. I opened a private channel to Callum during a rare, quiet moment, uncertain exactly what I intended to say, only knowing that silence no longer felt like an acceptable option. I need to ask you something, and I understand if you cannot answer honestly given everything you have been through. His response came slowly, weariness evident even through the limited emotional range my translator could convey. Ask, do you regret any of this? The fighting, the losses, everything you have sacrificed to protect people who may never fully understand what it cost you. His answer, when it finally came, remained with me long after this assignment eventually concluded. Regret implies I had a real choice to make differently. I did not. Not really. Not if I wanted to remain someone I could still recognize when all of this finally ends. I did not fully understand the depth of that statement until much later, when I began to comprehend the true nature of what motivated humans to endure hardships that would have broken almost any other species I had studied throughout my career. It was not simply duty or obligation that drove their continued resilience. It was an unwillingness to become someone fundamentally different from who they believed themselves to be, even when circumstances demanded impossible sacrifices. This realization changed how I understood everything I had witnessed throughout this assignment. Humans did not endure their conflicts because suffering had become normalized or acceptable to them. They endured because the alternative, abandoning their fundamental values in the face of hardship, represented a loss far greater than any physical cost the conflict itself could impose. I began to understand, during this period, that my initial assignment had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what I was being sent to observe. This was never simply a study of tactical behavior or strategic decision-making among a young species still navigating internal conflicts. This was an opportunity to witness something far more profound, the true depth of what a species could endure when their core values demanded sacrifices that logic alone would never justify. I did not yet know how this understanding would shape the remainder of my assignment, or how deeply it would affect the report I would eventually be required to submit back to my directorate. I only knew, sitting alone in my pod during the quiet hours following that difficult conversation with Callum, that I had been profoundly changed by everything I had witnessed, in ways I would likely never fully recover from. Whatever remained of this assignment, I understood that my perspective on humanity, and on my own role within their ongoing struggle, would never return to the detached simplicity I had carried with me when I first arrived in orbit above their world. The message from my directorate arrived without warning, cutting through my communication systems with an urgency that immediately told me something significant had changed. Observer Virel, your extended presence has exceeded standard assignment parameters. Immediate recall is required. Submit final comprehensive report upon return. I stared at that message for a long time before responding, understanding that this recall marked the end of an assignment that had transformed me in ways I could never have anticipated when I first accepted it. I had come to this planet expecting to document a young, chaotic species from a safe, professional distance. I was leaving with an understanding of humanity that I knew would follow me for the rest of my existence. I opened a channel to Callum's detachment one final time, uncertain exactly how to explain what was happening, or how to say goodbye to people whose survival had come to matter to me more than I ever expected possible. I have been recalled. My assignment here has concluded, and I am required to return to my own people immediately. The silence that followed felt heavier than any silence I had experienced during our entire time working together. When Callum finally responded, his voice carried a complicated mixture of emotions I struggled to fully interpret. I suppose I always knew this would happen eventually. You were never really one of us, no matter how much it felt that way sometimes. I understood the truth in his words, even as they carried a weight I had not expected to feel so deeply. I had never truly belonged among them, despite everything we had shared over the past months. I was an outside observer who had crossed lines I was never meant to cross, forming connections I was never meant to form, and now I was leaving behind people who would continue facing danger long after I departed, without whatever small advantage my presence had provided them. I want you to know that everything I witnessed here changed how I understand your entire species, I told him, aware that these words felt inadequate given everything we had experienced together. I came here expecting to document simple conflict behavior. I am leaving having learned something about courage and sacrifice that my own people have never truly needed to understand. Isla's voice joined the channel, quieter than usual, carrying an emotion I recognized now as genuine grief. Will we ever know what happens to you? Whether you make it back safely, I do not know, I admitted honestly. My own journey home carries its own uncertainties, though nothing comparable to what you face here every single day. Peter's voice followed, younger and more direct than the others, though carrying the same underlying weight. Thank you for everything. I don't think I would have made it through some of what we've faced without knowing you were watching, without knowing someone up there actually cared what happened to us down here. I did not have an adequate response to offer him, understanding that whatever words I chose would fail to capture the depth of what I actually felt in that moment. I settled instead for something simple and honest, the only kind of response that felt appropriate given everything we had shared. I will carry what I learned here for the rest of my existence. You have my word on that. Grace's voice came last, softer than the others, carrying an exhaustion that had never fully left her since I first began observing this detachment. Take care of yourself, wherever you are going, and if your people ever decide humans are worth understanding properly, tell them what you actually saw here. Tell them the truth, not whatever they expected to hear before you arrived. I promised her I would, understanding even as I made that promise how difficult it would be to convey the full truth of what I had witnessed to a directorate that had sent me here expecting nothing more than a simple, forgettable report on an unremarkable young species. My departure from orbit above their world felt different from any other assignment conclusion I had experienced throughout my career. I did not feel the relief that typically accompanied the end of a long observation period. Instead, I felt a persistent ache, a sense of leaving behind something unfinished, people whose fates remained uncertain and whose continued survival I would likely never learn the outcome of. The journey back to my directorate's central archive gave me considerable time to reflect on everything I had witnessed and to consider carefully how I would frame my final report. I understood that whatever I wrote would shape how my entire civilization understood humanity going forward, potentially influencing decisions about future contact, future observation, and future interaction with a species whose true nature had been so profoundly misjudged by every previous assessment I had encountered. I began drafting my report during the long journey home, discarding numerous versions before finally settling on language that felt honest to everything I had experienced. Subjects previously classified as young and chaotic demonstrate levels of coordination, sacrifice, and collective resilience that exceed nearly every civilization currently documented within our observational records. Initial threat assessments require complete revision, recommend extreme caution in any future strategic planning involving this species, not due to hostility, but due to a depth of resolve that our own civilization has not encountered in comparable form. I continued writing, describing specific examples that had shaped my understanding throughout the assignment, careful to include details about individual humans whose personal stories illustrated the broader pattern I had witnessed. I wrote about Callum's willingness to hold impossible positions rather than abandon those depending on him. I wrote about Isla's steady voice guiding frightened people through danger, and the personal cost that steadiness ultimately extracted from her. I wrote about Peter's youth, spent in constant vigilance, about Martin's patient wisdom shared even through his own exhaustion, about Grace's unwavering commitment to healing regardless of the emotional toll it demanded from her. I wrote, finally, about my own transformation throughout this assignment, acknowledging openly that I had crossed professional boundaries I was never meant to cross, that I had become personally invested in outcomes I was only meant to observe, and that this personal investment had ultimately taught me more about humanity than any amount of detached observation ever could have. When I finally arrived back at my directorate's central archive, I submitted this report knowing full well it would likely generate significant scrutiny given how thoroughly it contradicted previous assessments of human behavior. I was correct in that expectation. Senior members of my directorate questioned me extensively about my methods, about my apparent departure from standard observation protocols, and about the personal language woven throughout what was meant to be an objective scientific assessment. I answered their questions as honestly as I could, understanding that my career within the Continuum Observation Directorate might not survive this level of departure from expected procedure. I explained everything, the direct communication I had established with the detachment, the tactical information I had provided during moments of crisis, and the deep personal connections I had formed with individuals I was only meant to study from a distance. I fully expected disciplinary action, perhaps even removal from active observation duties, given how thoroughly I had violated the fundamental principles of my profession. Instead, something unexpected happened. My report, despite its unconventional format, sparked genuine reconsideration within higher levels of the directorate regarding how humanity should be classified and understood going forward. Additional observers were dispatched to different regions of Earth, tasked with verifying my findings through independent observation. Their reports, submitted over the following months, confirmed much of what I had documented, describing similar patterns of coordination, sacrifice, and resilience among human populations facing their own distinct challenges across different parts of their world. I do not know, even now, what long-term consequences this shift in understanding will eventually produce. I do not know whether my directorate will ultimately decide that humanity deserves formal contact, continued careful observation, or some entirely different approach that has not yet been fully considered. What I do know is that my assignment fundamentally changed how at least a portion of my own civilization understands this remarkable, complicated, deeply resilient species. I think often about Callum, Isla, Peter, Martin, and Grace, wondering whether their conflict has finally reached some kind of resolution, wondering whether they remain safe, wondering whether any small part of what I provided during our time together ultimately made a meaningful difference in their survival. I was sent to observe humans at war, expecting a simple, forgettable assignment involving a young, chaotic species barely worth serious study. I completed that assignment, having witnessed something I did not have adequate language to fully describe even now, something that fundamentally changed my understanding of courage, sacrifice, and the true depth of what a species can endure when their core values demand it. I do not regret the personal cost this assignment extracted from me, despite how thoroughly it disrupted the professional detachment I once believed was essential to my work. I do not regret the connections I formed, even knowing I may never learn what ultimately happened to the people who shaped my understanding so profoundly. What I regret, if regret is even the correct word for what I actually feel, is that I cannot fully convey to anyone who has not witnessed it directly just how remarkable humanity truly is, how much they endure, and how much it costs them every single time they choose to hold their ground, rather than abandon those who depend on them. I was sent to observe humans at war. I do not think I will ever fully recover from what that assignment taught me. And even now, knowing everything it cost me personally, I would not trade what I learned for anything my own comfortable, detached existence could have offered instead.